Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. My name is Phyllis Zembler Miller, and today I have with me Mordecai Paldiel. Now, he is the former director of the Department of the Righteous among the Nations at Yad Vashem. This recognizes non-Jewish saviors of the Holocaust, and it's a very, not anyone gets it. Yeah, it's a big, complicated process. And he also has his own Holocaust survival story to tell us, which brings us to one of his newest projects that he's very proud of. And this is a pack of playing cards that he did with the Sousa Mendes Foundation, which includes the card of someone who saved his family. So tell us about first the idea for the cards.
Okay, the idea of the cards is, I'm associated with the Sousa Mendes Foundation, who was an extraordinary rescuer of Jews. He disobeyed his government and knew what the consequences would be for him, and he paid a very stiff price. Uh, and He died in poverty after all of his valuables were taken away from him by the government. And that was led by a dictator by the name of Antonio Salazar.
We need to say a Portugal dictator, right?
A Portugal dictator, yes. Uh, on the other hand, I just want to add in parentheses that the people who came to Portugal eventually made it to them as a way station. They wanted to proceed further across the sea from Lisbon. In Portugal, they were well treated. There were no demonstrations. There were very, very minor restrictions on their movements. And the Portuguese population treated them quite well. The people who spent time in Portugal, mainly Lisbon, have a very good memories of their stay in Portugal, which is not the same for other countries that Jews passed through. Even Switzerland, where a country that hosts the Jews, uh, Jewish people who came there illegally were interned in places. But in Portugal, they simply had to report to the police once in a while, but then they were free to move around Portugal and so on. So anyway, we talk a lot about Sousa Mendes, who saved thousands of Jews by giving them visas to transit through Portugal. And I felt that maybe we're not doing a full service to the idea of goodness. People will say, oh, well, Sousa Mendes, that's fine. There's always exception to the rule. The rule is everybody minds his own business, nobody cares, and people say because it's too risky. But there's always a few mad guys, good guys, who
Okay.
break the rules, and they're heroes, so we're going to salute them. But I'm not one of those, so cut me out of this. I'm not going to do that. So I wanted to show other examples of people who acted likewise. Maybe they were not capable of saving the number of people that Sousa Mendes did, but they also took risks upon themselves, and they didn't consider themselves heroes, and they weren't trying to perform some heroic deed, and yet they saved. So they may have saved one or two or a handful or a dozen, but that helping others in need when the need arises is something that was performed by thousands of others who didn't know of each other. They didn't belong to some kind of a club where people were part of being a member of a club was trying to help other people. They all did it by themselves because they felt it was an obligation. It was an obligation to do it. And if they could do it, then perhaps you people out there in the audience could also do a good deed. And you don't have to be a Sousa Mendes. You don't have to you don't have to have thousands of visas. Uh, so um, that's the idea that went through my mind. And finally, when I heard from uh, Olivia Mattis about the card game that honors people in sports and music, etc., I said, how about uh, how about selecting some of the people that save Jews who come from different walks of life, and they wore different clothes. Some of them were plain secular people, some religious people, some educated, some non-educated. And Olivia tell me, all right, but there's one limitation. We only have 54 cards in the pack. I said, all right, I'll choose the 54 and I'll diversify them. I'll have men, women, and people from different countries. And I'll have a few Jewish names there because Yad Vashem does not honor Jewish rescuers. So I said, I'm going to add a few Jewish names. And we worked on this and we came out with a pack of with 54 cards with, of course, one of the conditions was we need a good sized picture of the person. And so we found those 54 names. And I'm very proud and I'm very happy with the results.
So now let's talk about your personal savior, Simon
Okay,
Galley.
okay, so my
So start with your
my-
story, your story.
yes, of course. Uh, my family, my parents were like many other Holocaust survivors. After World War II, he didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to mention it. His message was, forget about it. Let's continue with life. Let's forget about that thing. And I knew a little bit. I knew that I was born in Belgium. My parents had come there from Poland
Do you know what year your parents came from Poland?
in the my father came in the late 1920s, my mother in 1934. They met in Antwerp, Belgium, and they married. And I was born in 1937. And my brothers and sisters were born. Some of them were born in Belgium. But then came the war, the German invasion in May 1940. And like many others, like millions of others, we fled into France because uh, the uh, the feeling was by many that the French would hold back the Germans as they did in World War One, which it didn't happen. So France fell quite quickly.
Can I
Uh,
ask you just to give a visual? Did you actually have a car? Did you flee by train? How did you?
okay, so actually we fled by train and we switched trains because we found out that one train was going in the wrong direction. It was not so good. So finally, we were on the train with many refugees, not necessarily Jewish, all of plain Belgian people who were fleeing the Germans, because Belgium was occupied in World War One, so they had memories of that it was not a pleasant
Yeah,
situation to be occupied, especially by the Germans.
yeah. I want to
So
just say one thing for those of us who care about history. Holland was not occupied in World War One, so they didn't have the same memories that Belgium did. But Belgium had been occupied in World War One.
yes, for instance, the Netherlands or Holland was not occupied, was neutral. And so was Denmark, and so was Norway, and so they didn't have the memories of Germany. But they heard a lot what Nazi Germany represented. They heard a lot about the concentration camps already in Germany, and about Nazi policy and about Adolf Hitler. So they knew that it was not going to be a picnic, even in Holland. But Holland and Belgium had declared neutrality, but Hitler decided otherwise. Anyway, we fled into France and we stayed in several places. The places that we originally stayed in were part of what is known as Vichy France, which is the part which the Germans allowed the French to have a government, of course, which was under German pressure, and the government was established in the city of Vichy, which is a resort town, and not in Paris, because Paris was part of France, which was under direct occupation. And the Vichy part of France, which is like a third of the French territory, was where the Germans were not there physically. So there was a Vichy government. They had their own police, their own small army, but they were anti-Semitic too.
Yeah,
But
wait. I have something I need. I really don't understand. So at the very top of France, that part was put into an industrial area that had something to do with Belgium. Then there's the part that the Nazis controlled. But why did the Nazis allow Vichy France in the first place?
what did the Nazi allow? What?
Vichy France to exist in the first place?
Well, okay, so we're getting into Hitler's goal. Hitler had a goal. His main goal was not France. uh, France was to be taken out from the war and kept quiet and kept calm. His main goal was to find some kind of entente with England, because he had a high regard for England. He considered the English to be Aryans. His main goal was to expand Germany physically towards the east. In other words, turn Poland and large swathes of Russia into German territory. The Ukraine, Belarus, and that's where Germany, the main goal, and that's where resettlement would happen. In other words, Germans, Dutch, Scandinavians would be resettled in parts of Russia, and the Russians would be pushed further back into Russia. And that's where Germany, the future German Empire, would be located. Okay, there was not going to be any resettlement inside Belgium or inside France. Okay, so to keep the French were very patriotic, and Hitler knew that. So to keep the French calm, he said, "All right, I will allow you to have a little government of yourselves. Okay, but you got to be friendly with me. Okay, if not, there'll be consequences." And that was Vichy. Vichy was headed by Philippe Pétain, whom the French hailed as a hero because he was a big general in World War One, and he held back the Germans in a famous battle, the Battle of Verdun, uh, and he held them back, and there were thousands of soldiers, both French and German, lost their lives, and so he was considered a national hero. And the Germans felt that the French people would accept him to keep what was left of France, to keep them and some kind of sovereignty, semi-sovereignty. But he was anti-Semitic, but not in the German way, not but in the government that he led felt that the Jews had attained too much freedom, too much power, and they should be restricted, should be second-class citizens, let's put it that way. All right, but life was tolerable. Synagogues were not vandalized. Jews could still go to school, but Jewish people were fired from important jobs. So if you were a professor, you could no longer teach history. You could no longer teach history in the
Now, are
French.
we talking about both the Paris region and Vichy, or only in Vichy?
I'm talking about Vichy.
Okay.
In the territories, the two-thirds of France, which is the north and the eastern and the western part of France, facing England, because Germany was
Right.
still at war with England, there the Germans applied their own laws and so on. However, the Germans agreed that the French laws, which dealt with police matters and so forth, would also be applicable in their zone of operation. But otherwise, they had direct control. And of course, Paris was under direct German occupation. The whole intent was to keep it calm over there, while Germany prepared itself for the mass onslaught on the Soviet Union, which took part a year later after France fell. But anyway, we stayed in several parts of France, and finally we abutted in Marseille, which is a big city in southern France on the coast on the Mediterranean Sea, and we were there for a while. Somehow we managed. There were Jewish organizations helped us, but then the situation changed in November 1942, 2 years after France fell. In November 1942, the United States invaded Morocco and Algeria. That's the first time that Americans got involved in the war in
Wait,
Europe.
this was called Operation Torch, is that right?
That's right. That was on November 8th. And so the Germans decided that they were going to occupy Vichy too. Because Marseille, because Vichy, France, and the coastline of Vichy, France, that faced North Africa. So that represented a threat. So on November 11, the German army marched into what was known as Vichy France, or Free France, in quotations, Free France. It was not actually free. But the government of Vichy was still in power. So it was a funny situation. But now the Germans could round up the Jews there, which until November 42, most of the roundups took place in the German part of France. But then when they needed extra people to round up to fill in the quota, they asked the Vichy government that they round up the Jews there and turn them over to the Germans. So Vichy complied and to the German demand, and it picked up Jews that were actually French citizens. They had not been naturalized as French. But
Wait,
this,
wait, I have a question. Didn't France right about now rem remove French citizenship from a whole class of people?
yes. Well, the French decided that those who were naturalized after 1927 were no longer to be considered citizens, and therefore they could be turned over to the Germans.
Was there a reason for 1927 or it was an arbitrary?
Well, that was, the prime minister of France, the Vichy government had a head of state, which was Pétain, and the prime minister was Pierre Laval. Laval was more anti-Semitic, and Laval felt that Germany was going to win the war, and so and there were too many Jews in France, and the Jews had really stepped out of line, and therefore, and the most disliked of the Jews were what they called the Frauen Jews, the Jews who either had not been naturalized or they had been naturalized, but they were still speaking Yiddish. They were not really French and so on. But then the Germans insisted uh, to denaturalize even those who had become citizens before 1927. And Vichy said, no, that's going too far. The Germans then said, how about forcing the Jews to wear the star? And Vichy said, no, we can't do that because the French people would not accept that in Vichy. So they did it in their zone, the Germans. But all Jews had the label J attached on their ID cards, and uh, and Jews had some restrictions, like if they wanted to move from one city to the other, they needed police permission. But Vichy held back from. They were very sensitive to public opinion in France. So although there was anti-Semitism in France, but it was not the German type, and French felt that there's a limit to everything, and we should not subdue to German demands. And of course, the public opinion was also very fiercely anti-German, more than anti-Semitic,
I was going to say, right. Okay.
more than
That's
more than
another,
okay.
that's
So
another story.
Jews were not popular, but the Germans were really hated. There's a long history of French-German rivalry and so on. So anyway, we happened to be in Marseille, and here were the Germans, and they began to round up the Jews. And again, per the agreement that they had before, the roundup was to be done by the French police. The French said, "We want anyone who has to be arrested should be done by our police." Uh, they wanted to maintain more levels of sovereignty. And the Germans said, "All right, you arrest. We'll tell you how many we need, and you pick them up." So we learned in Marseille, we escaped the roundup. Somehow they didn't get to the floor where we were staying in a certain building, but then the word got around. See, when the Germans invaded the Vichy France, then the Italians, who were allied to Nazi Germany, they said, "How about giving us a part of the France that now you occupied everything?" So the Germans said, "All right, we'll give you a few regions of south eastern France," and that became the Italian zone. Now, Italians were fascists, of course. In fact, fascism was born in Italy in 1922, not in Germany. But they were not necessarily anti-Semitic, and they didn't think that creating a German empire has to do with persecuting the Jews. They couldn't figure out why this is connected with that. But if the Germans asked that the Jews be restricted a little bit, so they passed a few anti-Jewish laws. But that's as far as they went. But and anyway, the news got out, the rumor that in the Italian zone, Jews were not harmed. So we fled to the Italian zone, and we arrived in Grenoble, which is a big city in what was then the Italian zone. And there were Jewish organizations which were allowed to function under the Italians. And they told us they arranged for us to be in a little village outside of Grenoble called Vars. So we stayed in Vars, and things were quiet and peaceful. But then the Italians realized that they were losing the war. And on July 25, 1943, Mussolini was even arrested by his own people, something unthinkable. And the Italian army began slowly to withdraw from many parts of the Italian zone. That was in August 43. So we decided if the Italians withdraw, the Germans are going to come in and take it over. And I remember one day in Vars, I saw a unit of German soldiers already passing through the town of Vars. I was standing on the sidewalk. I didn't know I was Jewish then.
Wait, you
And
didn't know you were Jewish?
no, and I was 6 years old. I went to first grade in the little town of Vars, Varces. Uh, and I was watching because why was I watching the Germans? Because in school they told us if you kids don't behave, we'll turn you over to the bad crowds, the Bosch, and they love to eat little children. So behave. So we said, oh, these Germans, they love little children. So I said, I got to watch them. I want to see these monsters who eat little children. So I watched and I saw them walking. They were not parading. They were just walking through. It was a hot day. And I saw them, some of them were middle-aged German reservists. And I said, they don't look like people who eat little children. I said to myself, of course. But then my parents, when I came home, I saw them packing. And they said, we're leaving right away. We're taking a bus. They somehow received a permit to my father and mother to go to Evian-les-Bains, which was in the former Italian zone. And the permit that they received was because Evian is a resort town. It has mineral water coming out from the mountain. So a lot of people who have problems with their skin, with their health, it's like the Dead Sea where people go to the Dead Sea to swim. So we received from a doctor like permission to take the bus and go to Evian. And why did we go to Evian? Because first my mother went. My mother was told by Jewish people from Grenoble there was a certain priest in Evian. We can't give you his name, but you'll find him in that church. When you get off the bus stop, you make a left and then you make a right and so on in the church. And that priest, he helped people cross into Switzerland because we were all trying to get to Switzerland. The Germans were slowly occupying the Italian zone, slowly. We had to get away. And so my mother went. So my mother said to my father, I'm going to see that priest. And my father said, are you crazy? You don't even know. Maybe he's a collaborator. Maybe he's going to turn you over to the French police. And my mother said, so what do you want? You want us to sit back and wait for the Germans to take full control? And besides, my mother looked less Jewish looking than my father. My mother could pass so-called Aryan looking. She had light skin and she could speak French better than my father. My father spoke Polish and Yiddish, but his French was not good. So if somebody stopped my mother on the train and asked questions, so on, she could respond. So she went to that church and she spoke to that priest. And she told the priest the truth. I am Jewish. She took me along and my two sisters, but she left us in a little bar. She didn't want us to come along into the church. And she met that priest. She didn't know his name. And she told him, maybe you can help us to get to Switzerland. We were told that you're helping people. And there were two priests there. One of them was Gallet, Simon Gallet. He was the local priest, but the head priest there was another man by the name of Simond, Simonds, Simon. And he was also honored by Yad Vashem. But anyway, they told my mother, okay, in the meantime, one of the nuns will take you to a home with your three children. I was there with my two sisters. my mother, we were then 6 children. And also my grandmother was there, my mother's mother. But they stayed behind in Varsh. They didn't come along. Uh, what my mother and father decided, if my mother felt that the priest could be trusted, she would send him a telegram in coded language and say, come over with everybody else. You can come over, it's safe. So we stayed in a house for about a day or two, and some of the nuns, they brought us some food. And I remember I stole out in the garden and I picked some blueberries, and I was not supposed to do that. I was told to stay put inside the house. But as I looked out from the window, I saw blueberries. I said, oh my God, I can't miss that. And then I ate so much that I had an upset stomach, but that's a different story. But after 2 or 3 days, the priest came back and he said to my mother, it's arranged. We'll take you across. Bring the rest of your family. So my mother cabled, how she cabled that, I don't know, from the post office to the post office in that little town. And my father came up with the little kids and my grandmother. And we were now all together. My mother was very thankful to that priest, whose name he did not disclose, and she didn't know then. But she was told before that he is known as Monsieur Plebin, but that was not his real name, Plebin. And later on, we learned later on that plebeian was a nickname, was a code name for him. It comes from the Latin plebis, which means a people, a local, a man of the people, plebis, so plebeian. But that was not his real name. We later on discovered his real name was Gallet. But in those days, people didn't go by their real names, because if somebody was arrested by the Gestapo, and they were tortured to give out names, they couldn't give out real names. So people went by people who were helping others to do illegal crossings and so on. They didn't go by their real names. They went all by all kinds of nicknames. So that is very, very well known in Holocaust literature. So anyway, my mother was very thankful. She was in tears. And she said, I want to give a gift to the church before we leave, after all. These are difficult days, war days. And she began to remove her wedding ring. That's what my mother told me afterwards when she wrote down her story. I asked my mother when I came to Yad Vashem, Mom and Dad, you got to tell me the story now, how we escaped. I mean, you were holding back, but I'm working at Yad Vashem and I'm helping other people with their stories of rescue, and I have a story of rescue, and you don't want to tell me anything. So finally, they wrote down everything. They wrote it down in Yiddish, but I read Yiddish, so I had to translate it to English. So anyway, the priest said, don't remove the wedding ring, it's yours. I don't want to take it. Only thing is, remember me. That's all, remember me. And then he gave her instructions to take a train to a little town closer to the border called Thonon-les-Bains. Thonon, Thonon, Les Bains. And then from there, take a bus, a local bus, to the surrounding little villages and get off at that stop and go to the little bistro, little coffee shop, and wait. Someone is going to come for you. These are the instructions. And good luck.
Good luck.
And that's what we did. And then in the bistro, 2 men came. Of course, the priest didn't tell us their names. I later on I discovered their names when I was. 2 men came, and they looked at us and they said, follow us. And I remember that evening
So wait, I just want to review. This is the summer of 43. Is that correct?
No, it was already September. It was September 8th.
Of 43. Okay.
of 43. On September 8, Italy formally surrendered to the Allies. And so the Germans took over everything of the Italian zone, including the city of Cannes and Nice, Rotan, where they caught a lot of Jews. And they took over the border control of between the Italian zone of France and the Swiss border. But we escaped on September the 8th, on that day, and the Germans had not yet replaced the French police on the border. So anyway, the two men, I remember that evening. It was a cool evening, and we walked in a forested area. And I didn't know why we were walking in the evening. I had no idea about being Jewish and so on at that time. And I asked the two French guides, why are we walking where are we going? I was carrying my little kid brother, who was 8 months old, in my hands. And one of the guides said, it's a great adventure. We're going out to meet Tarzan. Tarzan was a big name in French comics. Tarzan, the ape man. And he told me, look up on the trees and you'll see him appearing. And I felt it's very exciting that we're going to meet Tarzan. I had no idea. But anyway, we walked and then we came to a fence. And one of the French guides, or passeurs as they were known, the passeur means they were crossing. So these passeurs didn't take from us money. Some of the other passeurs, you had to pay them a lot of money. But they were working on behalf of the clergy of the, okay. They cut the barbed wire and they said, all right, between two barbed wires and then cross all of you. So we crossed. We walked about 100 feet and there was another barbed wire. And they cut that too. They had a pair of pliers. And I remember I cut my hands. I didn't. But anyway, we crossed and we were now on the Swiss side. And once we were on this side, they took us to a little ridge and they told us, sit down. And a Swiss border patrol was soon going to pass. And we are leaving here, we're going away because we can allow ourselves to be captured by the Swiss because we are part of the resistance and so on. So, but if you're lucky, they'll allow you to stay in Switzerland because the Swiss had changed, the Swiss would allow refugees to stay there if they came with little children under the age of 6. So I had two little siblings who were under the age of 6. So we sat there on a ridge alone when suddenly we heard shouts in French. That was the French part of Switzerland. And I remember this to this day. It was haut les mains, which means hands up. Haut les mains, I remember that. And I saw two Swiss in uniform coming out from the bushes or the trees there with guns, with rifles. And I said to my mother, Maman, c'est des soldats, these are soldiers. And she said, I can't be bothered now because I am nursing one of the little kids. She had her breast out and nursing one of my little, funny, 8-month-old little sister. And the two guards repeated their order, hands up. And so finally, we all raised our hands. I remember raising my hands. And I thought this was part of the great adventure. I had no idea what was happening. And then the two guards, one of them says, oh, refugees. And they said, okay, follow us. They took us to a truck. They took us to a side road there on the Swiss side. And the truck took us to a base, a police base there. And my father was made to fill out some forms and sign. And then they took us to a room where there was a lot of grass and hay on the floor. And they said, sleep over the night here. And then we'll tell you tomorrow what the decision is, whether you can stay in Switzerland or not. They checked with their superiors. And in the morning, they said, well, the orders we received, you can stay in Switzerland. Yes, you can stay. However, the men will be separated from the women, and the two older children will be separated from the other children. And my grandmother, too, will go to a different camp where there were some older people. Detention camps. Nothing brutal, nothing this. And so I was sent to, with my elder sister, she was 1 year older than me, to Bel-les-Bains, in a mountainous town, to a children's home, which was under the management of the Jewish Federation in Switzerland. And that's the first time I discovered I was Jewish, because they had us say our prayers in the morning, things like that, with my sister. And my mother stayed with the other little children separately in Geneva, in a certain place. And my father stayed in a labor camp someplace in Switzerland. He passed through 4 labor camps where
All in Switzerland.
all in Switzerland, where he had to cut wood and do some, labor. And my grandmother was taken to another camp on the German side of Switzerland, where they spoke German. And my parents and my mother, they tried to have us reunited. And it took like 8 months before the Swiss allowed all of us to be together in Geneva. So by the summer of 1944, we were all together again as a family in Geneva, where the Jewish Federation there helped us a little bit. And funny, what I discovered later on, that we also received money from the Polish embassy. The Poles had what they called a legation, not an embassy, and Bern is the capital. And there was a Jewish fellow working there, a man by the name of Kuhl, Kuhl, and he was dealing with Jewish matters, so Jewish refugees, because the Swiss said, we'll allow the Jewish refugees to stay here, but they have to pay for accommodation and food. Somebody has to pay for that. So since we came without any money, except my mother had a few diamonds sewed up in her dress just in case she needed to exchange it. So the Polish embassy, they received a bill from the Swiss police for the accommodation and so on, and they paid for our maintenance. The Polish embassy. That I discovered after the war. I even got documents about that when I worked at Yad Vashem. So we stayed in Belgium until the end of
You stayed in Switzerland.
Switzerland until the end of the war. And then we're told by the Swiss, that's it. You have to get out. You have to go back to your country of origin. So you can't stay here. You're illegal refugees. So sometimes I say to myself, maybe Trump took a page from them, like go back to your country from where you came. So we took a train and we went back to Belgium. And we came to Belgium and we came back to Antwerp. And there we learned for the first time the scope of the Holocaust. We didn't, in Geneva, we listened to the news coming out from the BBC from London about the atrocities, gas chambers, and we didn't believe it because we didn't believe the Germans were capable of doing such thing. Germany was held in high esteem by Jews in general. Germany was the center of culture. They're not barbarians like the Poles, like the Russians. The Russians were considered to be the barbarians of Europe. Why? Because all the pogroms originated in Russia. Everybody was talking about the pogroms. And my father comes from Poland. He comes from Poland when Poland was part of Russia, before World War I.
Right.
And so everybody knew that the Russians were beasts, pogroms, but not the Germans. The Germans were civilized. And in fact, in World War I, the Germans did not mistreat the Jews. So we said, oh, that's British propaganda. When they said the Jews were being turned into ashes and so on, come on. But when we came back to Belgium and my father began to ask about some of the people that he knew in Antwerp before the war, and he asked, where are they? And the answer was that they were taken and they didn't come back. They were taken. And then the news got out, Auschwitz, yes, that's true, so on. So that's the first time that we really believed, because some of those who survived the concentration camps, the few, they came back to Antwerp and they told what they went through. So, so we settled down in Belgium. My father went back to his business, which is cutting diamonds. Belgium was a diamond center, very, very popular with Jews. And we stayed in Belgium for 4 years. And then in 1949, we all of us feared that another war was about to break out, this time between Russia and the United States. There was a lot of tension in Berlin. There was a Berlin blockade. The Russians blockaded in 48 already in Berlin. And it looked like, here we go, another war between these two giants who were allies against Hitler. But now they're going to fight. And the Russian army was already in Germany, in East Germany. So it was easy for them to get to Belgium. So we had to.
Although I have to put a plug for the American Army because my husband and I were stationed in Munich from September 70 to May 72, and we were stationed there on purpose in West Germany to prevent the Russians. And we had to go to evacuation lectures of what we were supposed to do if the Russians came across the line. So yeah, this history is very important for me.
But there was a great fear that it's going to be another war. Uh, the Russians had not yet developed the atomic bomb, the United States in 48, maybe 49. But anyway, it was time to get out of Europe. So my father wanted to go to Israel. Israel was created in 48. And my mother said, no, because there's a war going on in Israel too. I'm through with wars. And my mother had a sister in Brooklyn, New York. And my aunt, she wrote an affidavit, actually. And she said, the affidavit of support in case they needed support. And so in 1949, finally, we went to, my father was still a Polish citizen, although he lived in Belgium, but in Belgium, it was hard, very hard. It was more difficult in Belgium to be naturalized than in France. In Belgium, at that time, the law said to be a citizen of Belgium, you had to be born in Belgium. And my father was not born in Belgium, neither my mother. So we were legal residents. We were not illegal, but so we still kept our Polish passport. So we had to renew the Polish passport, which we did, and we had to wait for the visa to come through. And so, to make a long story short, by the end of 1949, we took a train, again a train. We went to Cherbourg in France, and there we boarded. Guess what? The Queen Elizabeth, which came. The Queen Elizabeth left Southampton and picked up passengers in Cherbourg and headed to New York. So we came to New York over New Year's. We boarded the boat, I think, on December 26th. And on a day after New Year, I remember passing the Statue of Liberty. We all went on the deck to watch the Statue of Liberty. And we landed in Manhattan on January 2, 1950. In New York. And we took a cab. My aunt and my uncle had already found for us an apartment in a place which today is not in Bedford-Stuyvesant region of it was still a lot of Jews there, were surrounded by black communities. So, and I remember when we took a cab, and one of the first things that impressed me, and I felt it was so strange. I looked out from the window and I saw all from the buildings outside the cab, all the laundry was being hung up to be dried. And I said, this is like an uncivilized place. I mean, in Europe, you don't do that. You don't hang up your laundry facing the main street.
I know.
You do it maybe facing the inner courtyard. I saw people's underwear and women's bras hanging there and to be dried. I was shocked, really. Well, that's America, that's it's different. But anyway, we settled in Brooklyn. I went to yeshiva, and later on uh, came in 19 came the draft again, the Korean War, and the draft was renewed. So in 1959, I was drafted in the U.S. Army. I became a citizen, American citizen, and they sent me to Germany, and I was in Germany for half a year in Kaiserslautern with the U.S. Army, and then they transferred me to France, and I was in France, not far from Bordeaux, with the U.S. Army. And in France, there was a different story. There was then a rebellion by the generals against de Gaulle. He wanted to give up Algeria, so we were also on alert. And when I was released from the army, from the U.S. Army, I decided to make Aliyah. And I went in 1962, I went to Israel, and I stayed there. I studied at the Hebrew University. And I got my undergraduate degree. I met my future wife, married, and then came the 67 war. And here I am, a soldier in the Israeli army fighting the war. I remember fighting in 1967 war. And after the war was over, for a few years, I was a tourist guide. Tourism was booming in Israel. A lot of people came to see Israel and the expanded territory. I became a tourist guide. And then I decided I want to finish my education. So I went back to America, and I went to Philadelphia, and I registered at Temple University, and I continued my education. So I got my master's degree and my PhD at Temple University, where I studied history and theology, and they had a special program for Holocaust studies. So I did that
Yeah, go ahead.
at Temple University, and my mentor was Franklin H. Littell. He was an historian, and he was not Jewish, and he created the Holocaust program at Temple University. So in 1982, I had my PhD, and I decided I'm going back to Israel to find a job. When I went back to Israel, and this is a story I have to tell, it's very funny.
Yeah,
And I
because we
was
only
looking,
have a few more minutes, so go ahead.
so when I went back to Israel, and I was looking for work, and I met a former colleague from the Hebrew University for my undergraduate studies, and he said, "How is your Yiddish?" I said, "It's very good. Can you give the news in Yiddish?" I said, "Sure." So he took me to the radio station, and they talked to me in Yiddish, and they said, "Okay, we have a program every evening at 7 o'clock on a special station for 15 minutes. We give the news in Yiddish, and if you can do that, you got a job here as a news announcer in Yiddish." So I thought at least I have a job. On the way out, I was walking on King George Avenue, and I saw a sign, uh, work for academics. I said, work for academics? I'm going to go in. And I found out in that office, they were finding jobs for people who had graduated from university, couldn't find jobs. So I took out a number, and I was waiting in line for me to be interviewed. And then I looked up on the bulletin board, and I saw all kinds of announcements. There was an announcement. Yad Vashem is looking for a replacement for the job of a person that will head the Department for the Righteous Among the Nations. I said to myself, righteous among the nations? What the heck is that? I had studied the Holocaust, but never heard the term righteous among the nations. So I gave up my number to somebody else. I said, I'm going to catch a bus and go to Yad Vashem. I want to find out. So I went to Yad Vashem. And I went to the administration. They said, well, there's about 24 applicants who had already applied. So I said, never mind, I'll fill out a form. And so I filled out the form. A few days later, I got a call. Can you come down for an interview? So I came down to an interview. And because they were impressed with what I wrote and everything, I gave him good references. And then I was told, you got the job. And in November 1982, I became the head of the Department for the Righteous. And I stayed there for 24 years. And I discovered a whole new world. that I never knew of before. And I promoted and I expanded that. And I brought in more people and really the whole story. It changed my life. I found out that there's a lot of goodness. When we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about man at his worst, and which is true. But then I found out that there were people who were acting at their best, how people should act. And they were all mostly individual persons,
Right.
and they didn't act in unison. I said to myself, all the terrible things that happened in the Holocaust, these are people who acted together as groups, either in uniforms or everything. And all the people who rescued, they made their own decisions. It was a lonely decision. They asked by themselves and they risked their lives, and somebody paid with their lives when they were caught.
Yes.
And I said, this is amazing. So I began to write about that. I wrote books and articles, and I started giving lectures and speeches, even at Yad Vashem. And so it changed my whole outlook on life and about human behavior at a deep level. I found out that there was Rabbi Harvey Schulweis from California, and he had already created the program. So I got in touch with him. And so that changed my whole perspective about the Holocaust to a certain degree. So I believe very strongly that, so people would say to me, even at Yad Vashem, Mordecai, don't talk so much about the righteous Gentiles. Because why? Because people would think, all right, everybody was standing in line to save Jews, and you're diminishing the story of the Holocaust. So my response was, on the contrary, the fact that people were saving Jews and hiding them,
At the risk of their own
people
life.
will say, why were they doing that? Were they criminals? No, they were totally innocent. Why? Because there was a Holocaust. So that backs up the story of the Holocaust. When a person had to hide on the ground or in a pigsty or in an attic and not to show his face, and he had done nothing. Why? Because they wanted to kill him because he was Jewish. So that supports the story. So I'm saying that doesn't deny, that doesn't diminish, and so on. So I felt that the best way to talk about the Holocaust is to introduce stories of people who saved, who act goodness, and then on the background of that, you can tell about what the Holocaust was. Okay.
I absolutely agree. In the book I'm writing, Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust, I'm going to include a lot of these, I don't vignettes or whatever, because what I'm trying to say with this book is this is what happened. It could have been stopped. Okay, we won't go through that now, but this is what we can do today. We need to be cognizant and we need to think about how we can act now for good. So,
Yeah.
with that, unless Mordecai wants to add two sentences, because we've gone almost an hour, which is really long, but you're so interesting that I love talking to him. We've interviewed him before, but I think that you make a very good point that we need, which is why I end every one of these things you didn't know about the Holocaust podcast was saying, may the memory of the victims and those who tried to save them be a memory forever.